Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Azure Network Security in the Field. My name is Andrew Mathu, your host for this series. In this series, we dive into topics across Azure Network Security, covering Azure Firewall, Azure Web Application Firewall, Azure DDoS Protection, and Azure Bastion. If you're also looking to sharpen your skills, you can check out our ninja training at aka.ms/easynetsecninja. And for the latest updates and deep dives, please visit our blog space at aka.ms/easynetsecblogs. In today's episode, we'll explore the different layers of DDoS defense available in Azure, from Azure DDoS Protection to the newer application layer DDoS capabilities in Azure WAF. The goal is to help you understand where each layer fits when you need them and how they complement each other. I'm excited to be joined by Saleem as our guest today. Saleem, please welcome to the show. Could you start by introducing yourself and tell us a bit about what you work on?
Absolutely. So first, thank you, Andrew, for hosting me today here. So my name is Saleem Bseeu. I'm a product manager at Microsoft CxE team, and I work in Azure Network Security products. So those are like Azure Firewall, Web Application Firewall, DDoS Protection, and Azure Bastion.
Awesome, that's great to hear. And welcome to the show once more. I'm very happy to have you here. So let's just jump straight into it, and I'll go maybe to the first opening question. What does the DDoS threat landscape look like today? And why should organizations running in the cloud be worried about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So DDoS threat landscapes have evolved a lot over the last years. DDoS is, of course, far from a solved problem. What we're seeing today is that the attacks are not just growing in volume, and we're talking here about terabits per second in some cases, but they're also getting more sophisticated. So attackers aren't just throwing traffic at you anymore. They're running multi-vector campaigns, right? So they might hit you with a massive volumetric flood at the network layer to overwhelm your bandwidth. And then at the same time, they're sending carefully crafted HTTP requests that look perfectly legitimate. And these are targeting your most expensive API endpoints, for example, to exhaust your application resources. And the other thing that people sometimes forget is that the cost angle here, right? So even the cloud where you can scale elastically, if someone is flooding your application and you're auto-scaling to absorb it, your bill can spike dramatically, right? So it's not just about the availability, it's also about protecting your budget here too. So any organization with internet-facing workloads should be thinking about this. It's not just a matter of you'll be targeted, but when.
Okay, that's a great overview and something for customers definitely to take seriously when it comes to their DDoS protection. So moving on, what in Azure, what DDoS protection do customers get by default in Azure, and where does it fall short?
Yeah, so by default, all Azure customers get Azure DDoS infrastructure protection, right? And that's always on, and it protects against large-scale network layer attacks using the same platform that protects Microsoft services. And this is for the Azure infrastructure itself. However, it's a shared baseline service, right? So what it means is that it's not tuned to individual applications that customers have and workloads, right? And customers don't get any visibility, alerts, mitigation reports, or cost protection in that case. It's a strong safety net, but it's not a complete solution for critical workloads.
Okay, that's good to know. So in this case, I know we have what we call Azure DDoS protection. So what is Azure DDoS protection, and how do network protection and IP protection differ?
Yeah. So Azure DDoS protection adds advanced capabilities such as traffic monitoring, automatic mitigation, metrics, alerts, and reporting for L3 and L4 attacks, right? And the difference between the SKUs that are available today is mainly in scope and added benefits, right? So the network protection, and that's the original one, first one, is designed for larger deployments, and it includes rapid response support, cost protection, and WAF discounts, right? So usually this is more targeted towards customers or users when you have more than, let's say, 10 public IPs that are critical or lead to critical workloads that need to be protected. Now, the second SKU is called IP protection, and it's scoped per public IP. And this SKU is better suited for smaller environment, but without the added enterprise features, right? So if you have fewer than, let's say, 10 public IPs, then you can use this SKU, which is more, let's say, cost-friendly in that case.
Okay, that's a great overview of Azure DDoS protection. And something maybe we hear from customers, they might ask, why do they still need Azure DDoS protection if they already have the inbuilt protection?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the built-in protection provides a baseline, right? But doesn't give you visibility, doesn't have a customer-specific tuning or your workload-specific tuning where you have the public IP attached and your resources, or any operational support, right? So the infrastructure is there to protect the Azure infrastructure, so any shared resources are protected. But let's assume that if there is an attack of, let's say, 200 packet per second, that is that could affect your, let's say, server or your API endpoint that you have, then in that case, that's where the Azure DDoS protection comes in, right? So what you gain is insights into active attacks. That's the first thing. The second is access to rapid response team that can help you with mitigating sophisticated DDoS attacks. And the final thing is the financial protection against scaling costs, right? So if you have like an application gateway or some other scaling resource, if it scales out because of an attack, then you have that financial protection in that case. So it's a difference between having a general safety net and having a dedicated application-aware protection for your workloads.
Okay, that's pretty good to know and very important, I think, message also to folks who want to protect themselves against DDoS attacks. So everything we've talked about so far, infrastructure protection, DDoS network, and IP protection, that's all operating at what we call the layer 3 and layer 4. How about the application layer, the layer 7? What do application layer 7 DDoS attacks look like, and why are they harder to detect?
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly as you said, right? So the Azure DDoS protection is there to protect you against volumetric and protocol layer 3 and 4 DDoS attacks, right? So when you're looking at layer 7, that's when the WAF comes in this case, right? So the application layer DDoS attacks, they use legitimate looking HTTP requests, which makes them very difficult to detect using a traditional and network layer defenses or view, right? Which you cannot detect those type of attacks. So instead of overwhelming bandwidth or volumetric attacks, they target application behavior. Like, for example, expensive APIs or backend processes in this case. And because each request appears valid, the L3 or L4 protection can't catch them. In that case, they don't have the visibility into them. And detecting these attacks require a very good understanding of the traffic patterns and also the application behavior that you have deployed.
Okay, that's a great overview. And at the application layer, still at this layer, how can customers detect and stop these layer 7 DDoS attacks in Azure?
Yeah. So at the application layer, stopping DDoS attacks requires a combination, right, of adaptive detection and targeted controls. The first layer, if we think about it, is the HTTP DDoS rule set that's available in Azure WAF today in both the application gateway and Azure front door in public preview. So this provides an adaptive protection. It learns your application's normal traffic patterns. It detects anomalies such as sudden spikes, abusive clients. And when it identifies the suspicious behavior, it can automatically mitigate those clients, right? So this is a particularly effective against DDoS attacks where no single request looks malicious on its own. The second layer is the rate limiting in WAF. So rate limiting gives customers a fine-grained and deterministic control. You can define thresholds based on what you know about your application in that case. For example, like limiting requests to a specific endpoint, like login pages or APIs. And this is very useful, especially for protecting against high value or resource intensive operations in that case. And on top of that, also, Azure WAF provides bot mitigation capabilities. So you have such as like JS challenges, CAPTCHA, and these also help with differentiate between like real users and automated traffic. So when a client is challenged, legitimate users can complete the validation in that case. And while most bots will fail or are significantly slowed down, it depends how also you configure it and at which level. So this makes it very effective against bot-driven application attacks in this case, right? And you can think of these or how these controls work as a layered defense, right? So if we put them, you have the HTTP DDoS rule set, so that handles adaptive large-scale behavior attacks. Then you have rate limiting against specific endpoints with known threats. And then you have the JS challenge and CAPTCHA, which helps filter out the automated bot protection in that case, right? So by combining all of these capabilities, customers can effectively detect and mitigate layer 7 DDoS attacks while minimizing the impact to legitimate users in that case.
Okay, that's awesome. A very, very good overview about layer 7 DDoS mitigation. I think that's quite packed with a lot of very good, useful information. So to bring it all together, we've talked about all these layers. We have the infrastructure protection, which you mentioned, and its shortcomings. We have the Azure DDoS protection. We have the WAF and rate limiting. Are these able to work all together? How do they all come together to work to mitigate against DDoS attacks at all these layers?
Yeah, absolutely right. So the best approach is layered approach in this case, especially when it comes to protecting against DDoS attacks, right? So if you want to think of it, a good approach is to think of DDoS protection and layered approach, and you start with infrastructure protection, right? So that handles large volumetric attacks against Azure infrastructure. Then the next layer, you have the Azure DDoS protection, which adds visibility, tuning, advanced mitigations for layer 3 and 4 DDoS attacks that are specific for your applications. And then you have the WAF HTTP DDoS rule set, which detects application layer attack patterns. Next one, we have the rate limiting, which is against targeted protection for specific endpoints. And then you have the JS challenge and CAPTCHA that mitigate bot-driven attacks, right? In that case, so each layer addresses different attack vector in that case, and together they provide a defense in depth approach.
Okay, yeah, that's awesome and quite comprehensive coverage against DDoS attacks. That's pretty good to know about. So to move on, and maybe the last question before the next section, where should customers start when building their DDoS protection strategy? What's the starting point? What can you say to our customers out there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So a good way to think about this layered or concentric rings of defense is where each layer protects against which type of attack, right? So the first one, the outermost layer, if you're thinking about it, you have the Azure DDoS infrastructure protection. So this is the baseline. It's always on. It helps absorb large scale volumetric attacks against the network edge and Azure infra. The next step then is enabling Azure DDoS protection, right? So depending on the use case, you can enable either network protection or IP protection SKU. This adds the intelligence on top of the baseline with things like I mentioned before, traffic monitoring, alerts, mitigation reports, and protection against sophisticated L3 and L4 attacks, right? And you can enable this either via public IP or the whole VNet, so all the IPs in the VNet that are connected to critical resources that you have. And then from there, you have you can move up the stack to the application layer, right, with Azure WAF. And if you have any endpoints like on the application gateway or on the Azure front door, where you should have less exposure, and make sure that that exposure is intentional and protected with Azure WAF policy, right? And this is where you enable HTTP DDoS rule set, which can learn your application's normal traffic patterns and detect anomalies, right? And then finally, you can add custom controls, like I mentioned before, rate limiting, with bot protection mechanisms like JS challenge and CAPTCHA to protect against those specific endpoints and filter out automated filter traffic, and specifically that works for your application, right? In that case, because there are very different levels of applications and architectures out there. And so the key takeaway from this is that there is no single layer, right, or product that really covers everything. You should always think of it that different layers and different vectors of attack. So network layer protection doesn't see HTTP traffic in that example, and application layer protection does not stop large volumetric floods, right? So you need all of these layers working together to have a complete DDoS protection strategy.
So it's a complete strategy. That's great to know. That definitely covers and gives very good advice to our customers. So that was a great overview, a lot to unpack, which we're very happy to hear about. So moving on, how does this look like under the hood? Can you give us a quick demo?
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me just share my screen over here. So as you can see, this is the portal view when you enter the portal. And in this case, we talked about different layers for DDoS protection. And I want to show you one example of this that where you can see all of these protections and controls. So in this case, let's take application gateway, for example, right? So I'm going to go to all the application gateways I have over here. And I'm going to select, for example, this one. So let's check this application gateway. And let's assume that you have this application gateway, you have your APIs, that they are connected to this application gateway, and it's a public endpoint. So you'll have a front-end public IP address, right? So as I mentioned, the first thing I would do here is I'm going to go to the public IP address here, and let's check if it has Azure DDoS protection, right? So that's the layer 3, layer 4 DDoS protection that we need. And I clicked on the public IP address over here, and down here, you will see there is protect IP address. So this is the DDoS protection status, right? After opening it, you will see that the protection status I have here is IP is DDoS protected. That's because I have it enabled in this case. And you can select, of course, the SKU you need here, and you can also add it to a specific DDoS plan if needed. So this is the first thing that I will do. And to make sure that I have layer 3 and layer 4 DDoS protection specifically for the application gateway here I have and the applications that are running behind it, right? And just going down here to show you, for example, the metrics that are related in this case to this Azure DDoS protection. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to go, for example, let's check the threshold, right? So this is a threshold that was set specifically based on the traffic and the application scaling that I have for this. So this auto-tuned and made sure that my application is protected against DDoS attacks. So if the traffic goes over this threshold, it will start DDoS mitigation and mitigating the DDoS attack. Now, this is the DDoS protection on the public IP address on the application gateway, right? So let's go back now to the application gateway itself. And let's go now to the layer 7, right? So that's the Azure WAF that we need to look at. On the left side here under settings, you have web application firewall. So clicking on it, and what you will see here is that I have an associated web application firewall policy in this case. So I have a WAF policy that is attached to this web application gateway, and it's making sure that layer 7 attacks are mitigated. So let's open this instance we have here for this policy. And as you can see, the policy state is enabled. So this is enabled, but it's in detection mode in this case. So you can also change it to prevention to make sure that you're mitigating layer 7 DDoS attacks. And if I go down here to manage rules, and to show you exactly where you can enable the HTTP DDoS rule set is that, so you see here, these are the managed rules I have. And you can see here, this is DRS 2.1. So this is against common attacks that we see. And there's also some rules for bot rule sets. Now to add it, I will click on assign over here. And on the right side, it will show me 3 different rule sets, right? So we'll have the core rule sets, I will have the bot protection, and then I will have also the HTTP rule sets. So let's just wait for it to load over here. So as I mentioned, they have default rule set, bot management rule set, and the one we're looking for is the HTTP DDoS rule set, right? So right now I don't have anything configured. If I click on change it from none to Microsoft HTTP DDoS rule set, which is in public preview, and then just simply click on save. So this, what happens here is that this will enable this HTTP DDoS rule set, and it will start learning, right? So it will start learning the traffic, and after a specific period of time, it will be enabled, and it will mitigate against any HTTP layer DDoS attacks on this application. So let's move now from cancelled, and then it will show here once the change is done. And the other thing I wanted to show you is also the CAPTCHA and the JS challenge. So go into custom rules here, and you can see I have a few custom rules over here. And you can see, for example, I have a rate limit, right? So let me just click on this and see what we have configured. And you will see here, in this case, I have a rate limit that is grouped by all client address, and specifically for this request URI, right? And you can see the update was successful. So I have the HTTP DDoS rule set. And what's happening here is that I have this rate limit specifically for a request URI that contains 3 values. So 3 specific URIs I have set up for my application. And all the rate limit here is the threshold in this example is 3 requests, and rate limit duration 5 minutes in this case, right? But the rate limit depends on your application, on the logs, and what's needed, right? You can change this as needed and have very specific rules for it. And then the last thing I wanted to show you, going back to the custom rules, is the JS challenge here. So you can say that this is JS challenge. So if there is a request coming specifically for this request URI or any condition that you want to add, the JS challenge will be enabled, and it will prevent any bots from coming in. And we can also change the rule action here to, for example, log traffic only, deny, or allow in this case. And this is how you can enable here in the custom rules different types of mitigation that you need. So what I showed you here is it's a very simple example, but it's a way how you can enable this layered approach and where to find it, right? So you start with the public IP address, enabling DDoS protection there. You go to WAF policy you have enabled and look at the HTTP DDoS rule set and also your custom rules and other settings you have over here.
Thank you very much, Salim. That was a very, very great demo. Thank you for walking us through the DDoS mitigation solutions in Azure. Like we saw Azure DDoS Protection, and also saw the same in Azure WAF. So that was a great overview and really reinforced what we've been discussing about and what you had mentioned earlier about the different layers of protection against DDoS attacks. And thank you very much for also joining us as our guest today. We really appreciate it, and hope you to see you soon in another episode in the future. And to everyone watching, if you found this helpful, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your colleagues. Remember, you can access our Ninja training at aka.ms/aka, AZNetsec Ninja, and our blogs at aka.ms/AZNetsec blogs to keep on learning. Thank you very much for tuning in, and see you in the next episode.